As I said earlier, we are going to be spending our Wednesdays during Lent with the prophet Jonah. Now, while the book of Jonah is a very short book, it has some really important themes and messages that are included in it, and they are conveyed in both humorous and ironic ways. On the humorous side, everything in Jonah is big. I mean, this is a big story, a big city, a big fish, except Jonah. Jonah's compassion is just tiny, it's minuscule. It's a satire. It's what we don't expect. It's a critique. Everything and everyone in Jonah obeys God. The sailor, the sea, even the people of Nineveh, but not the prophet Jonah. He runs away from God. This is completely the opposite of what we would expect. Now, Nineveh was the most populous city of the Assyrian Empire, and it was one of its capitals. And we have to remember that the Assyrian army had conquered both the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel, along with many other peoples, and it was this huge empire. So when God calls Jonah to Nineveh, he's calling him to go and preach to people who are his enemies. Knowing this, we can better understand Jonah's actions when he runs away. I mean, let's face it, God is calling Jonah to do something really risky, to go to a hostile place and preach to people who are his enemies. Is it any wonder that he ran away? I have to tell you that Jonah is a character that I can identify with. In my experience, answering God's call has rarely made any kind of sense by worldly standards, and it has very often been quite disruptive. Way back when I was a member at the Lutheran Church in Osseo, Pastor Thompson was the first person to ask me if I was being called to be a pastor. And when he asked me that question, I answered immediately and emphatically no. And I believed that at the time. But I also could not ignore this sort of uneasiness that I had inside, this pull that I had, just this internal disruption. I didn't have any words to describe it to people. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I didn't have any experience to try and figure out what was going on. It was just this kind of uneasiness. So I signed up for the 2-year lay school program through the Synod, thinking that I might find some answers and some direction there. Well, and at the very least, to get prepared for whatever might lie ahead. So I finished the 2-year lay school program. I continued in my job as a photographer for LifeTouch. I've continued to volunteer in the community. I served in the church in various roles and ministries. So life just carried on. And then at one point, an intern pastor invited me to attend a global mission event in Fargo. It was a really transformative experience because I got a glimpse of how I might live my faith out. In my mind, to be a missionary meant that you were a teacher or a doctor or a nurse, and I was none of those things. I was an office administrator and I was a photographer, right? But I saw that there were so many other things that were needed and necessary. So I came home from that weekend. I went online and I applied for a 2-year assignment through the Global Mission Office. On Monday morning, I resigned from my job and I decided to put my house on the market for sale. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is that to everyone, including me, this made absolutely no sense, right? I mean, I had a job. I was gainfully employed. I had a home. I had all these things. I was active in my community. So this seemed really risky. It seemed really ridiculous, actually. It didn't fit into that whole idea of what we're supposed to do in our lives. I didn't have the answer to the most basic questions that people were asking me. I had to say over and over again, I don't know. I don't know. I had to relinquish control and lean into God. So after that short-term mission event, I went on a short-term outreach to Zambia and Malawi. And when I got back, I did accept that 2-year global mission assignment. I waited in the U.S. for nearly a year before finally being deployed to Uganda. And I served there for 3 of the next 4 years. And then I came back to the States and I applied for seminary, and I started that summer when I got back. And still at this point, even though I felt called to seminary, I did not feel called to be a pastor. And so there was this huge disconnect. So here I am in seminary, but not feeling called to be a pastor, just called into seminary. So that kind of raised a few eyebrows when people are like, oh, you're called to be a pastor? Well, no, not really. I'm just called to be in seminary. Not sure about the rest of that yet. But in my 3rd year of seminary, while I was on my internship, I finally got to a place where I realized that is exactly what God was calling me to. So from the time that Pastor Thompson first asked me that question until I finally said yes, we're talking about a decade or better. But I was finally at a place where I could answer that question without a doubt, yes. As human beings, we like to think that we are in control of our lives, that we have the ability to shape our futures, and that we don't really need to listen to God. And as long as what we're doing and what God is kind of calling us to are running parallel, it's all good. But as soon as God calls us somewhere else, we want to just stay the path, right? We think that we don't really need to rely on God or trust God. It's a real temptation, and that temptation is always there, to rely on ourselves and the trappings of this world. That's always part of life. But I think that temptation is especially strong when God calls us into something that feels risky or requires us to leave behind what is familiar and step into the unknown, to move forward when all we have are questions with no answers. This space between the here and this not yet something, it's sometimes called a threshold or a liminal space. And a lot of times you will see this described as a doorway. So a doorway, here's the doorway. You step over the threshold, you step through the door, and you're from here and you're suddenly to there. And to me, although that's a good illustration, to me it's more like a corridor that you have to journey through. It's a time where you might have to make some discernment, do some exploration, some prayer. You need to think and talk and speak with God and people around you. Sometimes you need to let go of something so you can embrace something new. It can be really frightening, but also really exhilarating. It can be something that we have to stop and wait within our corridor before we can move forward, but still it's this time of transformation. Like Jonah, when God calls, our first instinct may be to run away. The thing is that even when our first impulse is to say no to God, divine love continues to beckon us, to call us into the life that God intends for us. And even though we may be filled with doubt sometimes, God is faithful and God's love is steadfast. So, as we enter this corridor of Lent, we can trust God's guidance and love for us. And we can trust that Christ walks with us. Amen.